My in-laws placed my parents at a back table near the kitchen. When I asked why, my mother-in-law said loudly, "We didn't want them embarrassing the important guests." My fiancé shrugged. I walked to the DJ booth and made an announcement. Then I did this. The next day, their world collapsed because I knew something was wrong the second I saw where my parents were sitting. Our wedding reception was at the Grand Willow Ballroom in downtown Chicago. My fiancé, Ethan, had insisted his parents handle the seating chart because, as he put it, they had more experience hosting formal events. I let it go. That was my first mistake. When I walked into the reception hall after the ceremony, everyone was already seated. The front of the room was filled with white orchids, crystal centerpieces, and a long head table glowing under soft lights. Ethan's parents were at the center, surrounded by his father's business partners, a state senator, and two executives from the firm Ethan worked for. I scanned the room for my parents. They weren't at the family tables near the front. They weren't near the head table. They were in the back. Not just the back. A small round table pushed against the service doors near the kitchen entrance. Every time the door swung open, a server rushed out carrying trays. It was loud back there. Clacking dishes. Staff moving in and out. My dad was sitting straight in his suit like he always does at formal events. My mom kept smoothing the edge of the tablecloth like she does when she's uncomfortable. I walked over and asked if everything was okay. My dad smiled and said the food smelled great. That was when I noticed something else. The table only had 4 chairs. My parents, my younger brother Tyler, and an empty seat. No one else from my side of the family was nearby. My aunt and cousins were seated at another back table across the room, closer to the restroom hallway. It didn't feel accidental. I went looking for the seating chart display near the entrance. It was one of those decorative mirrors with names written in gold marker. I found my name at the head table. Ethan's entire extended family was up front. His college friends had the center tables. Even co-workers I had never met were closer to us than my own parents. I found my mother-in-law, Carol, near the bar talking to a woman in a red dress. I asked her why my parents were seated near the kitchen. She didn't lower her voice. We didn't want them embarrassing the important guests. The woman in red froze mid-sip. I asked what she meant. Carol said, "Your parents are sweet, but they are not exactly the type we wanted at the center of attention tonight. We have investors here." I waited for her to say she was joking. She wasn't. I looked across the room at Ethan. He had clearly heard at least part of it because he was staring in our direction. I walked over to him and told him what his mother had just said. He shrugged. He said, "Let it go, Annabelle. It is just seating. Just seating." I thought about the last 30 years of my parents' lives. My dad working double shifts at the auto shop. My mom taking night classes so she could move from cashier to store manager. Them paying for half this wedding because they insisted on contributing. And this was where they were placed. Near the kitchen doors. I didn't cry. I didn't argue again. I didn't cause a scene. I looked around the room at all the important guests. Then I turned and walked straight toward the DJ booth. The DJ, a guy named Marcus, looked confused when I tapped the microphone and asked him to lower the music. That was the moment I decided the reception was about to change. And nobody at that front table had any idea what I was about to do. The music faded mid-song. Conversations quieted in waves across the ballroom. Forks stopped clinking against plates. Marcus handed me the microphone without asking questions. I could feel Ethan watching me from the head table. I smiled at the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight. It means a lot to both of us to have such an incredible group of people here. Family, friends, business partners, investors." I let that word hang there for a second. I said, "Before we continue dinner, I want to recognize 2 people who made this entire day possible for me." I walked away from the DJ booth and started toward the back of the room. At first, people thought it was part of the program. Some even turned in their chairs to see where I was heading. I stopped beside the kitchen doors. My mom looked up at me like she thought I needed something. I said, "I want everyone to meet the 2 most important guests in this room. My parents, Daniel and Rosa Martinez." Some polite applause started. I didn't stop. I told the room my dad worked 16-hour days for most of my childhood so I could go to college without debt. I said my mom learned English by watching late-night news broadcasts so she could help me with homework. I said they taught me that respect is not something you earn with money but something you give freely. The applause grew louder. I pulled two empty chairs from a nearby unused table and placed them at the end of my parents' table. I said, actually, I think they deserve a better view. Then I looked at the guests seated at one of the center tables, a group of Ethan's co-workers I barely knew. I asked if they would mind switching tables with my parents. There was an awkward pause. One of the co-workers, a guy named Brent, stood up immediately and said, of course. He started gathering his drink and jacket. His wife followed without hesitation. Within a minute, that entire table relocated to the back. My parents tried to protest quietly, but I told them it was already done. Servers rushed to adjust place settings. Now my parents were seated in the middle of the room, directly in line with the head table. I thanked everyone for being flexible and said tonight is about celebrating love and the people who shape us. The music started again, but the energy had shifted. When I returned to the head table, Ethan leaned toward me and said, "You did not have to make it a spectacle." I said I did not, but someone did. Across from us, Carol's smile looked tight. Dinner continued, but I noticed something else. Several of the so-called important guests had started talking to my parents, laughing, shaking hands. My dad was telling one of the executives about restoring classic cars. My mom was explaining how she built her store from the ground up. They weren't embarrassing anyone. They were captivating the table. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. I was wrong, because later that night, when it was time for speeches, Carol decided she was not finished. And what she said into that microphone forced me to take things further than I ever planned. I should have known Carol wouldn't let it go. When it was time for speeches, the best man went first, then my maid of honor. Both were harmless. Stories from college, awkward jokes, the usual wedding stuff. Then Carol stood up. She didn't wait to be invited. She just walked to the DJ booth and took the microphone from Marcus. She started by talking about how proud she was of Ethan, how hard he worked, how bright his future was. Then she said something that made the entire room go quiet. She said tonight is not just about love. It is about building alliances, strong families joining together. I felt Ethan tense beside me. Carol continued. She said, when you marry into a family, you also marry into their reputation, their standing, their influence. A few of the investors nodded politely. Then she laughed and said sometimes that adjustment can be educational. There were scattered chuckles. She looked directly at my parents' table. She said, we all come from different backgrounds. Some of us from generations of leadership. Some from more humble beginnings. It was subtle enough that she could deny it later. But everyone understood. My mom stopped smiling. My dad folded his hands on the table. I waited for Ethan to stand up, to say something, to interrupt. He didn't. Carol ended her speech by saying she trusted Ethan to always make decisions that elevate our family. Elevate. The applause was polite but thinner than before. I leaned toward Ethan and asked if he was going to respond to that. He said, you are reading too much into it. I looked around the room. Several guests were not clapping. The state senator looked uncomfortable. Brent, the co-worker who had switched tables earlier, was staring straight at Carol. And then something happened that Carol did not expect. One of the investors stood up. His name was Richard Hale. He owned a regional manufacturing company and was one of the reasons Ethan's father had secured funding for his latest expansion. Richard did not go to the DJ booth. He just spoke from his table loud enough to carry. He said, I actually prefer humble beginnings. They tend to produce people who understand value. The room went silent. Richard turned toward my parents. He said, sir, I heard you restore classic cars. I have a 1967 Mustang that needs work. Maybe we should talk. My dad nodded once. Carol's face changed. The rest of the night continued, but the dynamic was different now. Guests who had been clustered around Ethan's parents drifted toward the center tables. Toward my parents. I thought maybe karma had already handled it. But when we got back to the hotel suite after the reception, Ethan closed the door and finally said what he had been holding in all night. He said, you embarrassed my mother. I told him she embarrassed herself. He said, you should have stayed out of it. I asked him one question. If this is how your family treats mine on our wedding day, what happens next year? Or when we have kids? He did not answer. Instead, he said we would talk about it after the honeymoon. There was only one problem. There was not going to be a honeymoon. Because while we were arguing in that hotel suite, something was happening downstairs in the lobby that neither of us knew about. And by morning, Ethan's family business would be in serious trouble. I did not sleep that night. Ethan eventually stopped arguing and lay down, scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. I sat by the window staring at the city lights, replaying everything. Around midnight, his phone started buzzing. He ignored the first call, then the second, then the third. Finally, he answered. It was his father. I could only hear Ethan's sigh. What do you mean he left early? No, that does not make sense. He would not pull funding over a speech. There was a long pause. Then Ethan sat up in bed. You're serious? He hung up and just stared at the wall. I asked what happened. He said Richard Hale left the reception early. And before he left, he told my father he was reconsidering their partnership. Apparently, after Carol's speech, Richard had pulled Ethan's father aside and asked if he agreed with what was said. When Ethan's father tried to brush it off, Richard asked a simple question. If this is how your family talks about people, how do you talk about your employees? By the time we were in the hotel room, Richard had already sent an email to his legal team to pause the investment deal scheduled for the following week. It was not a small deal. It was the deal. Without it, Ethan's father's company would struggle to stay afloat. Ethan said this is because you made a scene. I asked how. I did not insult anyone. I did not attack anyone. I just moved my parents to a better table. He did not answer. The next morning, things escalated. I went downstairs to meet my parents for breakfast. My mom tried to act normal, but I could tell she had seen something online. Apparently, one of Ethan's co-workers had recorded Carol's speech. Not the whole thing, just the part about reputation and humble beginnings. He posted it on social media with a caption that said this was said at my friend's wedding last night. It had already been shared hundreds of times. People in the comments were not kind. By 9 a.m., someone had tagged Ethan's father's company. By 10 a.m., former employees were commenting about how management treated staff differently based on background. By noon, a local business blog had picked it up. The story was spreading. Ethan came down to the lobby looking pale. He said his father was in crisis mode. Investors were calling. A board member demanded a statement. Carol called me around lunchtime. She did not apologize. She asked if I had encouraged someone to record her. I said no. She said this is your fault. I said you chose the words. She hung up. That afternoon, Ethan's father issued a public apology online, claiming the comments were misunderstood and did not reflect company values. It did not stop the fallout. By evening, two smaller partners had announced they were stepping back from negotiations. And then Ethan did something I did not expect. He asked me to make a public statement defending his mother. That was the moment I realized this was not just about a seating chart. It was about who he was willing to protect. And I had to decide whether I was going to protect him back. When Ethan asked me to defend his mother publicly, I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. He said if you post something clarifying that it was taken out of context, this will calm down. People will move on. I asked him what exactly I would be clarifying. He said just say she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I told him it sounded exactly the way she meant it. He ran a hand through his hair and said, you are letting pride destroy my family's business. That word again. Family. I looked at him and realized we were talking about two different definitions. I told him I would not lie to protect someone who insulted my parents in front of 200 guests. He said you are choosing them over me. I said I am choosing respect. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house. They had already unpacked the leftover wedding flowers I sent home with them. My mom had arranged them on the dining table like it was any other Sunday. My dad asked if I was okay. I told them everything. About the calls, the investors, the social media posts. Ethan asking me to defend Carol. My mom said maybe we should have just stayed at the back table. That broke something in me. I told her no. You should have been at the front. While we were sitting there, my phone buzzed again. It was Brent, the coworker who switched tables. He asked if he could stop by. An hour later, he was sitting in my parents' living room. He told us he was the one who posted the video. Not because he wanted drama, but because he had seen things at the company that bothered him for years. Promotions passed over. Comments made in meetings. Clients treated differently based on last names. He said when Carol gave that speech, it confirmed something for him. He also told me something I did not expect. Richard Hale had not just paused the investment. He had requested an internal audit of Ethan's father's company as a condition for reconsidering. And he had asked Brent to provide documentation. Brent looked at me and said what happened at your wedding gave people the courage to speak up. I had not planned any of this. I just did not want my parents sitting by the kitchen. That night, I went back to the hotel to talk to Ethan. I told him I would not make a public statement defending his mother, but I would make one of my own. He said, if you do that, there's no going back. I said, I know. He asked if I was really willing to risk our marriage over this. I told him it was already at risk the moment he shrugged. He did not try to stop me when I opened my laptop, and what I wrote that night changed everything. I didn't rant. I didn't insult anyone. I wrote 3 paragraphs. I said that at my wedding, my parents were intentionally seated away from the main floor. I said a speech was given about reputation and humble beginnings. I said I believed respect is not conditional on income, education, or connections. And I said I would never apologize for defending my family. I did not name Carol. I did not name the company. I posted it and closed my laptop. By morning, it was everywhere. People connected the dots without my help. My post was shared alongside the video clip. Former employees added their own stories. A supplier posted that they had experienced similar attitudes during negotiations. Then something none of us expected happened. Richard Hale released a statement. He said his company would not move forward with any partnership that did not reflect the values of equal respect and opportunity. He referenced recent public remarks as a catalyst for reviewing the deal. Within 48 hours, 2 more investors withdrew. Ethan's father's board announced an independent investigation into leadership conduct. Carol's charity board asked her to step down temporarily while the situation was reviewed. The world they had built on image and exclusivity cracked fast. Ethan barely spoke to me during those 2 days. He stayed on calls with his father, pacing the hotel room. On the 3rd day, he finally said it. He said, "You could have handled this quietly." Fast how? By pretending it didn't happen? By teaching our future kids to accept disrespect if it comes from someone wealthy? He didn't answer right away. Then he said I just wanted peace. I told him peace built on silence is not peace. That afternoon, I packed my suitcase. He asked if I was leaving for a few days. I told him I didn't know. What I did know was this. The seating chart was never about chairs. It was about where people believe you belong. My parents never asked for revenge. They would have forgiven everything. But the next day when I went to their house again, my dad showed me something on his phone. An email from Richard Hale. Subject line, Mustang restoration. Richard wanted to bring the car by next week. My dad looked at me and said sometimes the back table has the best view. Ethan's family lost their biggest deal. Carol lost her public image. And I lost a marriage that only worked when I stayed quiet. I did not ruin their world. I just moved a table. And everything that collapsed after that was already built on the wrong foundation.